Hi, this is Dr. Steve Pearson, and I'm going to be giving a slide presentation on the ICER value framework, which will consist really of an overview of both the conceptual elements and the procedures that ICER uses in its value assessment reports and appraisal committee voting at our public meetings. This webinar is meant to present an overview, especially of the changes that were introduced during the last round of modification or evolution, if you will, of the ICER value framework in 2017, and also the modifications that have been introduced for treatments of ultra-rare disorders. The primary audience for this webinar will be those participants in independent appraisal committees who participate in ICER public meetings, but it's also meant to reflect the latest status of our methods for all stakeholders. So some of the material will vary in its complexity and technical detail, but I hope it's accessible to everyone who's listening. So ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, is an independent health technology assessment group based in Boston. We've been in existence for over 10 years now, started as an academic project in my department at Harvard Medical School. And from the beginning, we have developed publicly available value assessment reports on a wide variety of different interventions in the health system, including medical tests, treatments, and delivery system innovation. Most recently, we have obviously become quite well known for our drug assessment reports, but we have a wide variety of topics, and you can review the full list on our website. We've also, from the beginning, believed in the importance of convening regional meetings at which independent appraisal committees will discuss the evidence, will hear further input and testimony from patients, from clinical experts, and from other stakeholders, and have a very important role in engaging with the broader public in discussions around effectiveness and value. These three groups currently are the New England Comparative Effectiveness Public Advisory Council, or New England CPAC, the Midwest CPAC, and the California Technology Assessment Forum. So the guiding principles behind the value assessment framework are these. First, we believe that truly rigorous thinking about evidence can help us prevent the kinds of waste that strains our ability to provide affordable care for all patients. That it really is important for us to think about evidence as it relates to our ability to care for patients. We also believe strongly that patients and the public should be more involved in assessments of value and discussions of how to apply evidence across the health system. Far too often, really important decisions around coverage, around pricing, around access, around quality, happen in ways that really don't benefit from the kinds of input that we think are very important. We also think that ultimately, when looking at the big picture, that evidence on the added benefit of treatments for patients, looked at also in the context of the price and what the insurance coverage is or should be, that if we can take the big picture and align these issues, that we will be able to achieve what can be called a grand bargain between added benefit, price, and insurance coverage, so that we really can foster innovation and create sustainable access to high-value care for everybody. So with those as the guiding principles, the purpose of the ICER value framework is that it's intended to really make more transparent how value is conceived of and to stimulate the kind of conversations that are needed. And so the framework is supposed to convey how value is represented in our reports. We specifically take what can be called a population level perspective. And this is important to recognize because some value frameworks are meant to fulfill a very important goal, which is to help improve the discussion around evidence at the bedside between individual patients and doctors. So our reports, though, are really kind of taking the broader population view, the one at which pricing and coverage and some of the other broader issues need to be tackled. And even though that's the case, our value framework really does seek to encompass and reflect the experiences and values of patients. And it's clear that there are always going to be some potential tension between the individual decision-making and the ability to tailor care for the individual and the decisions that are made at the population level. And we truly hope that our work through the value framework and in our reports and meetings can help explore that and not obscure it. So what is the broader conceptual value framework that underlie our reports? I'm going to show you a figure. First, we feel it's important to state that we do have a goal, sustainable access to high value care for all patients. And that's one that we strongly feel that all stakeholders share. So if you're going to think about value with that being the goal, we think that conceptually there are really two dominant components of value. One is the long-term value for money of an intervention, and the other is its short-term affordability. Now, first, long-term value for money, which is a really important anchor for decision-making and policy-making in the health system, because everybody is aware of how easy it is to get consumed with short-term considerations. But to try to reorient our healthcare system towards long-term value, we think it's important to think about four components of that conceptual idea. The first is comparative clinical effectiveness. The next would be incremental cost-effectiveness. Then other benefits or disadvantages, and contextual considerations. And I'm going to go through in detail a bit more on each of these in terms of how they're captured in our reports and how we hope to bring them into an integrated fashion in the way that we think about long-term value for money. So once you've thought about long-term value for money, it is important, though, not to leave completely outside the picture issues of short-term affordability, because sometimes there can be a real tension. Something that might have, for instance, excellent long-term value for money could still pose problems for short-term affordability. And to kind of get a gauge on that, we obviously need to analyze the potential budget impact. And so hopefully when there is a tension between those two major kind of conceptual ideas, our reports hope to identify that and hope that the discussions can again help navigate a way so that the long-term value for money can still be achieved while being cognizant of needs to think about and perhaps manage short-term affordability. So let's go a little bit deeper into each of these areas. First, I do actually want to start with a higher level summary of the key features across the broader conceptual picture of the value assessment framework. As I've mentioned, it's anchored in the long-term perspective on value. You'll note that it has a foundation in the evidence on comparative clinical effectiveness, that is a strong core element and where we really start. I'll talk about how we accept, always have, and will continue to accept multiple forms of evidence and how we put those in context. The value framework also gives explicit recognition to the fact that what matters to patients is not just limited to the measured clinical outcomes. And this is linked to the idea that we accept multiple forms of evidence, but it really is important to link that to the basic idea that what's studied in clinical trials, even when a drug is approved by the FDA, may not really capture certainly everything that is important to the patient. We also acknowledge through the value framework the role of contextual considerations in value judgments, and again, the inclusion of information on potential budget impact being a core feature. So first, to quickly give a snapshot of the report development process before we drill down into the different conceptual components. The overall process of a report from soup to nuts takes about 8 months. And it starts obviously with a topic selection phase. As ICER has grown and evolved over the years and we've come to do more topics, our process for topic selection has also evolved. But we have formal criteria on our website that kind of state our priorities when we're thinking about different topics. But Today, especially in the drug area, we're expanding so that we will be doing reports on most new drugs at or near the time of FDA approval, and a growing number of updates to our existing reports. But in the interim, as we still need to prioritize, the criteria are those that you might expect. They're drugs that would have a really important potential impact on the paradigm of care, that might shift a lot of the considerations around what treatment should come first or second, that might raise specific questions about competition between drugs with similar mechanisms of action. Those are the kinds of things that really have driven a lot of the interest in looking very deeply at the evidence and engaging all stakeholders as part of that process. So once we do have a topic, and even before we formally announce it, we've reached out at that point to patient groups and to manufacturers. And we start what we call a scoping phase with very intense sets of conversations with those two groups in particular. But we also talk with other stakeholders, clinical experts certainly, and we have an open input process through which anybody can send us input to help us really kind of understand what the key questions are that need to be answered, any major elements about the evidence that might not be obvious that people want us to be aware of. Basically anything that people feel is really important to a concerted effort to think deeply about the value of different interventions, we hope to hear very early so it can steer us in a variety of different ways. Once we kind of get our feet kind of on the ground there, and it does have a separate phase of public comment as well, following the posting of a draft scope, then we dig into the report development, which takes about 4 months. And that's the time during which we are searching for the published literature, doing a very systematic review of all the articles and kind of putting them in context, often doing statistical analyses in which the data are looked at in a way that we can do comparisons across different kinds of drugs, even if they've never been formally studied head-to-head. And also we're doing the development of a cost-effectiveness model as one of the core pieces of the long-term value for money. During that phase, and certainly towards the tail end of it, we start to get feedback on draft results from manufacturers and patient groups. They will have already had input into some of the assumptions, and again, the framing that goes into the scoping phase, but we give a kind of early feedback to make sure that we get input back from them about where people see key questions, key results that may not seem to match up with other perspectives or other analyses, that kind of thing. Then following that, we revise or continue to work on our report and post a draft evidence report for a long period of public comment. That will allow people to digest a relatively long document and to get comments back to us. And then we again have about several weeks following the closure of public comment for us to take everything and to reflect on it, to do additional revisions to our report as necessary. And we put out a revised evidence report, which is the report that's distributed to the independent appraisal councils, the CPACs or CTAF, in advance of the public meeting. So the members of those appraisal committees will get the evidence report and have time to read them before the public meeting. And at the public meeting, again, there's a kind of a choreography to it, an agenda that includes a summary of the evidence being presented, but a lot of opportunity for input from clinical experts, patient groups, other stakeholders, and manufacturers. So we run the public meeting as usually a near full day meeting, and following that, we put out a final evidence report that includes the revised evidence report, but also that contains a summary of the votes that are taken at the public meeting on the strength of evidence and the value, and a synopsis of the discussion, along with policy roundtable recommendations that emerge from the tail end of the public meeting, in which we have a roundtable with stakeholders, patients, clinical experts, payers, and manufacturers, with whom we really kind of wrestle about how do we take the evidence now that it's been discussed and voted upon, and how do we think about the best options for applying it to coverage, to pricing, to patient engagement and future research, to everything that we can do to move that evidence into the healthcare system in a way that will help us all meet that goal of sustainable access to high-value care for all patients. Just to put it in a different format, again, this is the 8-month kind of timeline with kind of landmarks for the topic announcement, the scopes, and all those kinds of things. And just to make the point about the multiple touch points, these are just those touch points with patient groups. Starts very early, and some of the most intense kind of back and forth we have are in the early going, where we have a lot to learn about the perspectives on outcomes and the diversity of the experience of living with the condition from patient groups. But it continues throughout the entire process, as it does with other groups as well. Okay, so let's go back now and start to drill down into each of the components of the value framework. The first one is comparative clinical effectiveness. So the foundation of this is a systematic review of evidence. That means obviously that we are not there to try to cherry pick articles that say one thing or the other. It's a very kind of dispassionate look to try to gather all of the evidence and then to make judgments about where some of the strengths of the evidence lie, which studies have the most to inform us about value. So importantly, again, here is that when we're looking at those, at the articles in the literature and other forms of information, it's the patient groups that really have a really important role in informing us what outcomes are important to look for. Maybe there are 10 different ways that a disease outcome has been measured in different kinds of trials, and we want to know which ones are the most important to patients so that we can help prioritize our own thinking in that way. But we also have a lot of other things to learn about living with the condition, including the differences about severity and how the different perspectives on evidence shift sometimes with severity, where patients are in the time course of their disease, and many other features. So we do our review of evidence looking at publicly available material, but we also have an option now that we've introduced to receive what's called in-confidence material from manufacturers. And that's primarily information that's, that has been gained from trials, from clinical studies, but that are in manuscript form or in some other way cannot be made fully public yet. So we have a kind of a set of principles for how we accept that kind of information for when it is likely to ultimately become publicly available, because we still try to balance our desire for getting the best evidence with our goal of transparency and engagement of the public in everything we do. Now, we're looking for evidence not just from randomized controlled trials, and sometimes this can't be stressed enough because randomized controlled trials are often viewed as the most quote-unquote influential or important evidence, but we are not just looking at RCTs. We look at observational studies, we look at abstracts even in the gray, what's called the gray literature, things that haven't yet undergone peer review, and we try to, again, synthesize that in a way that can help people understand the sources and the relative pros and cons of different kinds of evidence. Here again, patient groups can help us understand whether there's the opportunity to use existing real-world evidence that's often generated from patients themselves, or maybe we can work together to actually generate new real-world evidence. On at least several occasions now, we've been fortunate to work with patient groups to launch new surveys to gain new insights into the ways that patients think about value, about the different kinds of outcomes that they see as important, et cetera. Now, our comparative clinical effectiveness often boils down to the need to do indirect comparisons. I mentioned that before, where we may not have a head-to-head study. We've got drug A tested versus placebo, drug B tested versus placebo, and the real question is, how do drugs A and B compare to each other? So while always hoping that we will have drug A versus drug B trials, especially when drugs are first launched, that's rarely the case. So there are sophisticated ways to do what's called network meta-analysis, to do an indirect comparison, and that's a common feature of our systematic reviews. We also try to look at what's called the heterogeneity of the treatment effect. And this is the it's a challenge because sometimes when you're looking at a study result and the way it's published, you'll get an average result. But it's equally important to try to understand the spread, whether there's a small proportion of patients who receive a huge benefit compared to the other treatment and others who receive less or maybe even no benefit. So we try on a formal basis to make sure we get the best data we can to try to examine the heterogeneity of treatment effects and make sure that that becomes part of the report that can be discussed and considered when people are making overall judgments about value. Now, we do use in our reports what's called the ICER Evidence-Based Medicine Rating Matrix, which is a scoring or a grading approach to evidence. And it's a way that we use to summarize our preliminary judgments about the strength of evidence in a way that can hopefully crystallize our assessment, but also kind of foster a more concrete discussion about the evidence at the public meeting and in people's judgments. This ICER EBM rating matrix is shown here, and I'm not going to go through it in great detail. The details are available on our website. It has been peer-reviewed and published, but we have both kind of again, a verbal walkthrough of this and written material to help explain it. Just very briefly, you'll see it's a matrix with two axes. The vertical axis is one of the certainty that one can get from the evidence based on how many studies there are, whether they all show the same basic result or not, whether there are specific flaws that raise a lot of questions. And we divide that certainty into three levels: high, moderate, or low. Then the vertical axis is our best judgments, if we had to make it, of where we would put a pin as far as the comparative overall net health benefit. And again, that's frequently kind of framed as, by net health benefit, what we mean, it's not a financial net, it's comparing the balance of risks and benefits. So when we're looking at that balance and comparing two drugs, A and B, we might think, we think that there's a negative net benefit. That means that, if we're saying drug A is the new one and we're comparing it to drug B, we might say drug A is not as good overall. So it would be negative net benefit. Maybe it's comparable or equivalent in some people's terminology. Maybe there's a small net benefit, or maybe there's a substantial net benefit. And you can't put a specific number on how you decide whether it's comparable, small, or substantial. This really does reflect a judgment. And so in our reports, we give a rating, but we need to do a lot of description about why we think it's comparable or why we think it's small but not substantial, those kinds of things. And as you can see, depending on how much certainty you have in that judgment of comparative net health benefit, that gets you into one of the rows in the matrix, and hopefully can convey, again, both what you think your best judgment of comparative net health benefit is and the relative strength of evidence and your certainty in that judgment. So let me move on to the incremental cost effectiveness, excuse me, part of the value framework. So many people don't have much experience in kind of performing incremental cost effectiveness analysis or in reading about it. And we do a fair amount of training with our appraisal committees. But so I will go through a certain level of it here that assumes not a great amount of knowledge. Basically, incremental cost effectiveness, to do this, we're trying to look again at the long term. And we've only usually got shorter term data, maybe a few years out. So what we do, what health economists and others do, is they build computer models. It compares the long-term clinical outcomes and costs for different treatment options. So let me talk about the cost piece first. Let's say we're comparing, again, drug A and drug B. We are not just looking at the cost of the drug in these models. We're looking from the entire health system perspective, all healthcare costs. Now, for the cost of the drugs, we do actually use not the list price, but an estimate that we've come to have pretty strong reliance on of average discounted U.S. prices that are made available to us by a consultancy that has a way to reverse engineer these discounted prices For those of you who know about this issue, there can be a big difference between the list price and the discounted price. And so we feel it's of great importance to try to use discounted prices, because those are the real prices, in a sense, that are being paid by payers and ultimately, filter through to patients. Now, the societal perspective that we use on these analyses sometimes is not our dominant approach, except for limited circumstances that I'll talk about later. Usually we look at the cost from the health system perspective. When you say the societal perspective, what that means is that you might be looking at the impact of treatment on things like education or taxes or disability or things that happen outside the healthcare system. Now, sometimes that can be really important. Often it can be something that you want to think about, but for a variety of reasons, both conceptual and practical, the majority of health economics research is focused on the health system perspective, and that we try to be very transparent about what that means and what it doesn't, and when we are and are not able to kind of create a broader societal perspective analysis. So shifting to the measure of health outcomes, you can think of measuring health outcomes in different ways. Obviously, from a patient's perspective, they think a lot about their functional improvement, or maybe a treatment helps prevent negative outcomes for them. At a population level, you can think about treatments that might add life years, right? Help people live longer. Of course, that's of great importance to patients too. So this term life year is something that you can try to measure over a long period of time and many patients treated. But in addition to improving the length of life, you would want to think about the quality of life. And so there are specific survey tools and other measures that have been used over the decades to try to gather quality of life information from patients at different stages of their diseases, so that we can have a better understanding of when treatments with certain side effects, kind of what effect on quality of life will those side effects have. To try to sum all these up, the health outcomes for comparison across different kinds of treatments, health economists and policymakers for decades have found that the best tool to do that with is called a cost per quality adjusted life year gained, or cost per QALY measure. And I'm going to show you a graph that kind of explains how this works. But it's this kind of tool that allows you to compare, for instance, a treatment for a mental health condition with a treatment for a surgical problem or for a heart problem. It means that you have to take those very different outcomes from patients' perspectives and translate them through into how long people live and how it affects their quality of life. So let's talk more about this QALY. As I mentioned, it's recommended. It's been used by U.S. kind of health economists and others for many years, as well as internationally, and it is recommended as the best measure to use by recognized groups such as the Second Panel on Cost-Effectiveness in the United States. It is a measure of improvement in patients' lives by measuring the years of life weighted by an index of quality of life. And very simplistically, you can think of it as, for instance, with 1 being perfect health and 0 representing death. And everybody else's quality of life is somewhere between 0 and 1. And you get the quality of life estimates for these different health, what are often called states, derived from, again, studies of patients, as I mentioned. Sometimes you have to ask their caregivers, if they're kids, for instance. And sometimes you also use results from what are called community members. And all that means is that you ask questions of people who don't have the condition, how, in a sense, how much of their own health, how they value, in a sense, avoiding certain negative outcomes. And it's a way to capture, in some cases, a broader measure of the ways that we want to think about the quality of life of people with different health problems. When you sum all that up, again, you take the quality of, you take that quality weight times the duration of time in that health state, and then you sum all that up to get the QALY. This can be viewed also on a plane like this, where you see that blue dot in the middle represents, let's say it represents current treatment of a heart problem. And it has a certain cost, which is the vertical axis, and a certain effectiveness, which is the horizontal axis. And now let's say we have some new treatments for that heart problem. Well, what if the new treatment is less effective, so it's kind of going leftwards on that effectiveness axis, and more costly? Less effective and more costly. That one doesn't take too much difficulty in deciding. We don't want to do that one. We want to stick with what we're currently doing. What if we have a new treatment, though, that's more effective? So we go to the right on that axis, and less costly overall. And by less costly, again, think very broad term. It could be more expensive pill, but maybe it prevents hospitalizations or more doctor's visits at some point downstream. So overall, it's less costly. Well, here again, we have something that's more effective and less costly. We don't really need to do too much more thinking. We want to highlight this as the treatment to do, and it's sometimes called a dominant treatment because it dominates on both the effectiveness and the cost. Most of the time, we find ourselves in what's called the Northeast Conference, the upper right-hand quadrant here. And you can see we've got two choices here. Let's look at the one first that has the greatest effectiveness. There, that's a treatment that has a lot more effectiveness than the current treatment and just a little bit more expensive. The other one has high extra cost, much higher extra cost, and less gain. Still some gain, so it's still better clinically than the current treatment, but it's less effective than the other one. So obviously, if you had to pick between those two new treatments, again, it's pretty obvious which one would be better, the one with the high gain and effectiveness and low extra cost. But what about that other one? And this is where we come up with the question or the challenge of setting a cost-effectiveness threshold. Because ultimately, it's believed that health systems that are trying to think about value need to make some general judgment about the line below which we're getting enough gain in effectiveness for the added cost to make it the kind of good value that we want to accept and adopt into the healthcare system, and where we're getting not enough bang for the buck, where we might be getting a little bit better outcomes, but the cost is so high that it does not meet our threshold, if you will, our cost-effectiveness threshold. So, what is our threshold? This is a frequent bone of contention because it can be looked at from different perspectives. One important one is to think about how much a society is willing to pay for added health. And in some way, that is always going to be linked to how wealthy the country is. And through a variety of different ways of kind of analyzing this concept, groups such as the World Health Organization and the American College of Cardiology and many other health economists have adopted this general approach where that willingness to pay, that threshold, if you will, is somewhere between 1 to 3 times the per capita GDP, the per capita gross domestic product of a country, which would mean that if the cost for QALY is less than 1 times the per capita GDP, that would actually represent a high value or a good value, and anything higher than 3 times the per capita GDP would be low value, and we have this kind of gray zone in the middle between 1 and 3. So there are other ways, as I mentioned, of thinking about how would we decide where a threshold could be. The other is to ask individuals, what are you willing to pay? How much of your salary would you give up, for instance, to help improve your health? There are lots of different ways to ask this question, different kinds of health gains or avoiding health risks. So you can get answers that actually can differ substantially. But there has, over time, in many, many years, been a rough consensus around the fact that individuals will give up around 2 times their annual salary for QALY. The last way to think about it is a kind of a more empiric way in some senses. It's actually trying to measure what's called the opportunity cost for a health system This is really much easier to do in a health system where they have an actual budget and where they can try to measure if you accept something new that you're paying for into that budget, what do you get rid of at the margin? So it's really trying to kind of look at that at the margin, where are we, that's the idea of the threshold, what are we kind of kicking out when we bring something new in? And interestingly, when that work has been done in systems with budgets, it's turning out to be a slightly lower number in general. That if you're looking at the per capita rates again, it has turned out to be around 1 time per capita in the GDP in the UK, and also emerging work in Latin America is finding somewhat similar findings, lower than the other 2 approaches. Now, faced with this approach, with these different perspectives on the cost per quality threshold, and feeling that it was important in ICER reports to suggest a threshold that could be used for discussion around value and pricing, we have adopted a range generally between $50,000 to $150,000 per QALY. And when we come out with what we call value-based price benchmarks, we shoot for the upper end of that range, between $100,000 to $150,000 per QALY. Now, just to reflect on this, these are obviously round numbers, 50 and 150. If you go back to the per capita GDP in the US, that obviously increases with inflation and other features sometimes over time. And right now, if you did the official 3 times the per capita GDP, it would probably take you close to $170,000, whereas 1 times is about $54,000, $56,000. So it's very close. The 50 to 150 is very close to 1 to 3 times the per capita GDP. And again, as I pointed out, our value-based price benchmark is tilted towards the northern or the higher end of that range. But, and that's for multiple reasons, but it's partly also because even though this can be looked at empirically, as I've mentioned, some of the editorials and the broader perspectives on the cost per QALY general threshold in the US have tended to range between 100 and 150,000 per QALY. 50,000 per QALY in some ways is actually an historical figure that was used for many years. And with further empiric work, it may end up being resuscitated as a very important benchmark. But for now, we have used the broader range of 50 to 150, and we tend to stress the 100 to 150 when we're talking about how the price aligns or doesn't align with the added benefit to patients. Let me move on to the other 2 components of long-term value for money, and they are potential other benefits or disadvantages and the contextual considerations. Potential other benefits are meant to be, and I focus on the benefits here, and these are framed as benefits, but they can actually be disadvantages in some cases if a new drug, for instance, does the converse of this list of other benefits. But we always wanted to signal that there can be different things of value to patients, to caregivers, to the health system, or to society that do not fit easily in a clinical trial or even a cost-effectiveness model. Let me give you some of the examples here. So what if this intervention, for instance, provides significant direct patient health benefits that for whatever reason are not adequately captured by the QALY? That doesn't happen very often perhaps, but it has been raised in certain either mental health or in some pediatric conditions where it may be difficult for the QALY to directly measure at least what patients think about the health effects of a treatment. I'm not going to read all of these, but some of them include issues around complexity of care. The next one, for instance, says that an intervention offers reduced complexity that will significantly improve patient outcomes. This is the kind of archetypal issue here would be a study in which a pill is compared to an IV treatment. And let's say the average results are the same in clinical trials, but we know that clinical trials kind of have special elements that help patients kind of get the treatment, and so you're really kind of comparing in some ways a best, kind of best of all worlds approach, when in the real world, having a pill might make it much easier for patients to take the treatment. They would also not have to do the trip to the doctor's office. So we want to make sure that there's a way to capture that. And I'm not going to read the rest here, but what we do in our meetings is that we have these issues discussed. They're certainly the topic of input from patient groups and others. And then the independent appraisal committee will take a vote on whether there are or aren't significant potential other benefits in each of these categories that policymakers should definitely keep in mind when making judgments about value in the big picture. Similarly, there are contextual considerations. Some of these are considered ethical issues that weigh on the value equation. I'll read through a couple of these as well. The first bullet says this intervention is intended for the care of patients with a condition of particularly high severity in terms of the impact on length of life and or quality of life. Briefly, the reason this is here is because you might find that a certain amount of health gain as measured by the QALY from near perfect health to perfect health, let's say that gain is 0.1 on the scale of QALY. But what if we had another treatment for another condition where a patient started off very, very severely ill, down at 0.3, and they were improved to 0.4? Many surveys have suggested that we have an ethical instinct that we want to give priority to, in a sense, an equally effective gain if it's a gain for those who are most severely affected to start with. So many of these bullets capture either, again, ethical insights that some people feel are very important in considering value, or, again, broader contextual considerations, such as the third one, which says this is the first treatment to ever offer any improvement for patients with this condition. A situation under which, again, many policymakers feel that their judgment around uncertainty, around value is shifted. And so we want, again, this to be an important part of our reports and discussion at the public meeting. So going back again to the bigger picture of the conceptual framework, we've covered the 4 elements in our reports that we feel are important to capture and to discuss as part of long-term value for money. And now we're going to talk about the short-term affordability, the potential budget impact piece as well. So here, potential budget impact is, in a sense, is not that complicated in an idea. You try to estimate how many patients are going to be taking it, whether that will cost more in the short term. You're not thinking long term as much in terms of worrying about the short term affordability, at least. But ICER over the years has also asked if we could help identify a threshold that would signal when policymakers might really think that the potential budget impact is so high that it would have adverse effects and would therefore need at least some consideration for special management. So this is somewhat a long-winded bullet, but the purpose, in a sense, of having a threshold is just that. It's a signal to stakeholders and policymakers when the amount of added healthcare costs associated with a new service, even one with good long-term value, and that's important, may still be difficult for the health system to absorb over the short term without displacing other needed services or contributing to very rapid growth in healthcare insurance costs that would threaten that overall goal of sustainable access to high-value care. So just conceptually, or not conceptually, but in the real world, we can think of the experience with new treatments for hepatitis C. Sovaldi was the first of this kind of latest wave of new treatments. And when it came out, people said, wow, this might be really great because over 30, 40 years, it'll prevent people from getting as sick as they would have. Many patients will actually be cured. And it might not save money overall, but it'll be a great value. And indeed, our analyses suggested that it was a great long-term value. But that didn't mean that given the millions of patients in the United States who were eligible for treatment and who were often very eager to receive it as quickly as possible, that we didn't have a real bottleneck from an affordability perspective. And some kind of consideration around how to manage those situations we feel is important to signal with our work. equally important is to note that this is not implied to be a budget cap. It doesn't mean that we can't spend more for something that has great long-term value. It means we have to think carefully, because if we don't, we may actually end up with payers not feeling like they can afford it in the short term and end up having to be forced to do things that, if they could work with other stakeholders ahead of time, might avoid the same kind of problem. But it's not an implied budget cap. How we calculate it, again, I'm not going to go through each row here, because these slides and the details are available in printed format. But basically what we do, I'll just highlight the key issues. We try to link this to a key assumption, which is in the first row, which is that many policymakers in the United States, especially at the state level, will tell you that they don't feel that it is good to have our healthcare spending go up much faster than our overall economy is growing. We're up to about 18% of GDP now, and most policymakers think that if we grow rapidly from that point forward, it'll put real strain on our economy and on our management of the health system. So what we do is we look at the growth, the anticipated growth in the US GDP. We add an extra percent, because that is the way that actually one segment of the Accountable Care Act handled the creation of the trigger for changes to Medicare spending. And after that, we look at the overall spending on health in the US healthcare system, how much a percent do drugs currently represent of that. If drugs are going to grow at that same kind of GDP plus 1%, and we give all that growth, all of that net budget growth to new drugs, how much could we spend on them? Then we slice that up by row 6, the average number of new drugs each year, and we come up with the average net budget impact for new drugs if each got the same amount that would not kind of exceed that threshold. Now, we know if we're trying to use this as a signal, some kind of alarm, if you will, or signal to policymakers to pay attention, we don't want to set it just at the average. That might go off too often. It might not represent a true kind of issue. So we decided to double that. And that's where you see the 915 million, which is has been ICER's threshold for potential budget impact, where we basically announced that we may have an affordability and access alert. I'll talk a little bit more about how that's actually kind of playing out, but I'll just pause here to note also that this will be updated on an annual basis with new estimates for GDP growth, the number of new drugs coming through, et cetera. So this number will shift a bit from year to year. Preliminary calculations suggest that for the rest of 2018, it will likely go up to just slightly above $1 billion. Now, what we are trying to do in our reports when we present this is to make it as interactive as possible, because we know that different payers will have different thoughts about the threshold. They'll have different thoughts about the price they can get for the treatment. And they may have very different thoughts about what percent of the eligible patients will actually get the drug under different scenarios. But what we can do is to create a graph like this that has the budget impact threshold shown as a line reached with different combinations of prices on the vertical axis and the percent uptake on the horizontal. And we can ask questions. So we can say, if we know the price is $70, what percent of patients would be able to receive that drug without exceeding the threshold? You could say from the other direction, I think 10% of patients is the right number to get this drug. The others can do other things, other treatment approaches, et cetera. So 10% is my ideal target. If you kind of reverse engineer it from 10%, you can see that you would hope, if you don't want to exceed the threshold, to have a price of $50 or less. And you can also say, well, maybe $50 is the best price we can get, but if we could get $30, we could treat up to 20% or more of our patients. And sometimes we want to ask that kind of question. If we achieve a value-based price, for instance, how high can we go before we start to have any concern, or at least some increased concern about the budget impact? So that's the way that our reports are meant, they're not meant, again, to be prescriptive to a certain extent. They are meant to try to serve as a potential alert. And if we do have a meeting, at our public meeting, when we ask clinical experts and the manufacturers and the payers, what is the target? What should the target be? And if the target, let's say, is 25%, and the pricing, as we understand it from the company or from other sources, is $50, we may then say after the meeting that we need to be alert to this concern, that at the best estimate of the price and the target for clinical use, we are going to perhaps go way over that line. And again, it's not a cap. It doesn't mean we have to not do that. It just means that this should serve as a wake-up call to patients, to clinicians, to payers and manufacturers, to everyone, that we might need some proactive work to think about bringing the price lower or prioritizing patients for treatment in some way, finding the low-hanging fruit waste, finding other resources that can help us pay for this. Or in the context of other things going on in the health system, maybe this will be just fine. It's just a way to alert people to those situations in which the budget impact signals that it might be a problem. So going back again to this basic picture, just to talk briefly about where the value-based price benchmark comes, because that's a piece that the media often focuses on. It is anchored in the long-term value for money. We use the price at which you can achieve $100,000 to $150,000 per QALY, those kind of thresholds. That's the range that we call our value-based price benchmark. And then we do kind of reflect back on, if we had a price in that range, would it, if we're thinking about short-term affordability, create any problem, given the target and penetration of use among eligible patients that clinical experts and others suggest is ideal. So that's the dynamic. We anchor it in the long-term value for money, and we use it to reflect subsequently on how we can do this best in the healthcare system. If you look at the findings of our actual value-based price benchmarks and how much what they suggest about where the discounted price lines up, you get a real mix. If you see here in the first column, you've got different drug categories. This is not an exhaustive list, but it kind of shows a certain amount of the range or the spread of findings. The second column shows the discount in red from prices after rebate. That's the discounted price that would be needed to meet the top end of our value-based price range. So you can see for psoriasis, you would need only 5% more. So it's pretty close to meeting the top end of our value-based price range. Other areas like multiple sclerosis, almost every drug was fairly significantly priced above the level at which you could reach $100,000 to $150,000 per QALY in our analysis. Sometimes we find that the prices align quite well. Actually, the atopic dermatitis is an interesting situation in which the company worked closely with us and waited until they got draft results before finalizing their plans for pricing, and were willing to price within the ICER value-based price benchmark, actually lower than payers had been anticipating, as part of discussions around how to maximize the appropriate access to that new treatment for patients who needed it. But you can see, again, sometimes we find very substantial discounts, sometimes none are needed, and I don't have it shown here, but sometimes we actually find that the discounted price for a drug appears to be actually lower than it could be to fully align with the added benefits of patients. So now I want to shift to talk about how this approach is modified when we're looking at what we call treatments of ultra-rare disorders, or treatments for URDs. First, why should there be any modification for ultra-rare situations? The basic issues are that sometimes with smaller populations, and we find that many of them have less well-known natural histories of the disease course itself, you just end up, for a variety of reasons, with more uncertainty in the clinical evidence. It might be hard to do randomized trials. You might not really know what happens 10 years out with different kinds of treatment. So in a sense, you're just kind of stuck with that sometimes. When we're looking at ultra-rare disorders, we are also frequently looking at conditions of children with very high severity conditions. And the smaller the population, the greater the questioning that can occur about whether traditional cost-effectiveness thresholds will produce prices that, when you multiply them by the number of patients available, will provide enough return on investment to keep innovation going in those ultra-rare disorder areas. So that's why considering any modification makes sense. And most, if not all, international systems that are set up to do value assessment of drugs have separate tracks at some level of rarity, not just at the FDA regulatory level, but at the kind of payer level. They think about it somewhat differently. So after several phases of public comment and different ways to think through how we might modify our value assessment approach, here's what we decided to do and has now been launched. First, we did to create a label of ultra-rare disease that is distinct from the orphan drug label. Orphan drugs are defined in law, and it's the one that the threshold that the FDA uses is anything less than 200,000 patients. But we felt that the concerns that people have about producing evidence and judging it, and even the pricing, really didn't start to apply until you got to a much lower level of patients. So we set our threshold for consideration of a modified approach at 10,000 individuals, which is just, it's a bit higher than the European Union definition, but it's in roughly the same ballpark. We also thought it was important because so many drugs these days are coming into clinical use with an orphan indication first, and then sometimes rapidly expand, that we wanted to take a look and only apply a modified approach to looking at evidence and value if there were no ongoing or planned clinical trials that would lead to patient populations growing far beyond that 10,000 threshold. We decided not to change explicitly to create a different standard of evidence for judgments of comparative clinical effectiveness. So it's not like we were going to put on a completely different set of glasses to look at the evidence, but instead we did want to make sure that we provided very specific context regarding what I mentioned, the potential challenges of generating evidence for these kinds of treatments. So we want to make sure that in our reports we highlight the difficulties potentially in conducting RCTs, in validating surrogate outcome measures sometimes, and in obtaining long-term data, that these can have distinctively they can be higher challenges for ultra-rare disorder treatments. We also wanted to make sure that in our reports we talk about, in this area, whether there are commonly used approaches against historical controls. What that means is that for some conditions, it's just been the way that the FDA and others have been doing it for a long time, to use single-arm studies and compare their outcomes versus historical controls. So we'll try to provide evidentiary context and historical context, if you will. Other key other key modifications, we decided to expand the cost-effectiveness threshold that will be reported in our report, included in our report, from that 150 to 150,000 to 50 to 500,000 per QALY. But we are going to keep the value-based price benchmark at 100 to 150,000 per QALY, linking that to specific language that decision makers, there is a history of them accepting higher thresholds, especially again as the numbers get smaller and smaller. The idea primarily of return on investment and the fact that the overall budget impact is obviously going to be less if you have very, very few patients. So more information, the 50 to 500,000, but in a sense, still presenting the 100 to 150 as the traditional value-based benchmark pricing area, but with lots of context around how historically that has been more variable for treatments of ultra-rare disorders. Another important change here is that when the impact of treatment on benefits and costs outside the health system are really substantial in relation to the health system costs, we decided that we would do that societal perspective cost analysis and present it really in tandem with the results from the health system perspective. So again, for ultra-rare disorders where decision makers have a history of giving different weights or preferential weighting to different features, we felt here it would be reasonable to twin, if you will, the societal perspective along with the health system perspective when there are really kind of notable costs outside the healthcare system. Just a couple more. Basically, we include a broader framework for other benefits and contextual considerations because there is a potential for ultra-rare disorders for their entire kind of screening and care infrastructure to be revolutionized with the introduction of a treatment. Especially when there's never been a treatment before, you have a treatment, and it can really have a broader kind of impact on family, school, and community, and the infrastructure for screening and care of affected individuals. We also decided to create a section here for manufacturers to supply information on the cost of research and development if they desire. There was some discussion earlier about having a template and not requiring, because we can't do that, but kind of really kind of encouraging in some ways a specific approach to reporting on the cost of research and development. But what we decided in the end was that we need to think more about the unintended consequences, but certainly when manufacturers are in the position of claiming that their pricing needs to be at a certain level because of the costs of their research and development program, we hope that they certainly will put information about that, make it available, and we will include it in our reports. So in summary, for the treatments of ultra-rare disorders, we are going to have the same standards for evidence review of clinical effectiveness, but provide more context. We're going to use the same approach to cost effectiveness, but present broader threshold ranges. We're going to have the same core list of other benefits and contextual considerations, but amplify, if you will, some of them. And we will have the same value-based price benchmark, but again, added context indicating information on research and development costs and the history of acceptance of higher prices in many cases. Let me come back then, now that I've covered the kind of major issues with the value framework and its modifications for ultra-rare disorders. Since many of the folks who will listen to this webinar will be appraisal committee members, I wanted to talk to you again briefly about the agenda and how those meetings are run. So the CPAC or CTAF received the evidence report following the public comment period on the draft report. And about 10 days or so before the meeting, there's a call with 2 clinical experts. So the appraisal committee can, especially those who aren't clinicians, can kind of get the core issues about the clinical aspects of the condition clear in their minds. So it's an opportunity to ask clinical experts about current care, about patient selection. It's not meant to have a little kind of pre-meeting around the value issues. It's really to kind of focus on understanding the clinical aspects. Then at the public meeting, it kicks off with an evidence synopsis on effectiveness and cost effectiveness presented by the lead reviewers. We have patients and clinical experts available during that entire time to comment and respond to questions from the CPAC. Then we have a formal kind of manufacturer comment period when they can state their concerns, their suggestions, etc. And we also have a formal period of patient and any other people from the public who wish to comment. Throughout that, there's obviously discussion, questions, etc. But following that, there is further discussion and voting by the CPAC on comparative clinical effectiveness, other benefits and contextual considerations and value. So there are actually 3 different types of votes. One is usually framed such a question like, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that drug A is superior to drug B? Something like that. So that's the comparative clinical effectiveness. Then we'll have a separate vote, again, on every single one of those other benefits and contextual considerations. It's a yes or no. Is this a significant, should this be a significant consideration for decision making around value? And then we often, as long as there's a majority of members of the CPAC who have voted that the evidence is adequate on the clinical side, we have a vote on the value. And this is an overall vote on long-term value for money, in which the panel is asked, would you judge it high, intermediate, or low? And as you can imagine, there's usually a lot of discussion that occurs before those votes. Following the votes, we have the policy roundtable among the key stakeholders, and the meeting wraps up with concluding statements, highlights from them and from each of the CTAF or CPAC members. The final report, as I mentioned, comes out a couple of weeks after that with the associated summaries of the voting, with the commentary that occurs during the kind of the discussion. We try to capture the key themes of the policy roundtable discussion on how the evidence should be applied to coverage, to patient education, to research, to pricing, negotiations, etc. And that's my last bullet. It really is an important part of the meeting emerges from the discussion, because as important as the evidence is, we feel it's an important function of our meetings to highlight different issues related to how that evidence is translated through into the health system, in decision making, and in policy making. I'll leave you again with my penultimate slide showing the overall framework. We are going to have every 2 years a formal reevaluation with public comment and potential evolution of the methods, because we really do represent an important laboratory for thinking about how these issues can be assessed in a report, how they can be debated in public meetings, and translated through into decision making. So it's very likely that we will continue to learn, that we will pilot new approaches, and that we will look forward to certainly working with different stakeholders on their ideas and everybody's experience working with our reports and meetings. So thank you for spending the hour and almost 10 minutes listening to this. I hope it's addressed most of the high points of the value framework and the approach to our meetings. Thank you very much for listening, and we at ICER remain completely open to further ideas about the value framework. Even though we will have formal kind of update periods, we hope to learn and hear from people throughout. And again, thank you for your time.